Evening, folks. You can call me Muskrat Cole. I was a fur trader with the Indian tribes of North America, trapping and trading as they moved westward. I even lived with some of the tribes at times. I often worked as a guide for their cavalry. I'm here to tell you today the diplomacy, debate, and consequences that related to the settlers and the Native Americans in between the 18th and 19th centuries. Native Americans had inhabited North America long before Europeans arrived. When Europeans did arrive, 15 million Native Americans lived on this land. European fur traders, like me, were among the first to interact. Unlike the Europeans to come, we came in small numbers. We adapted to the Indian way of life. Then the European settlers came. They saw the Indians as savages because they were different from them. To them, the Indian was inferior, uncivilized. The settlers' policy involved the idea of manifest destiny, the thought that God gave them the right to take the Indians' lands. So they came across the ocean and said, "This is mine." The Indians' lives changed forever. The settlers brought diseases, smallpox, measles, which would wipe out thousands of Indians. They intruded on their hunting grounds and driving off game, destroying fisheries, which would lead to starvation, killing, and stealing. Soon, treaties threatened the Indian way of life. At first, the treaties were good for the both of them. The Indian had fur that the settlers wanted, and the settlers had utensils that made Indian life better. But then, their diplomacy changed. The settlers could not understand the Indians' policy that no one owns land. It belongs to everyone. When Indians negotiated treaties, a large delegation would be in attendance. Due to language barriers, interpreters, and cultural differences, much confusion and bad feelings arose. When the Indians were told they negotiated their land away in the treaties, they would say, "This land is ours. What do you mean it's theirs?" After the Revolutionary War, George Washington, now President of the United States, stated, "Their land and properties will not be taken without consent." And yet, the government was still looking to get their land. The infant United States encouraged their people to settle frontier lands taken from Britain. Between 1778 and 1871, the U.S. signed more than 500 treaties with various tribes. This would define the relations between the U.S. and Native Americans for centuries to come. In 1785, Hang on now, here just a minute, folks. I gotta get this precisely correct for you. Ah, yes, the Hopewell Treaty. The Hopewell Treaty of 1785. It set the western boundary for American settlement. The reason why I couldn't remember it is because the Cherokee called it the Talking Leaves Treaty. For as soon as the treaty did not suit those Americans, they would blow away like talking leaves. President Jefferson's policy was known as the Civilization Program. Jefferson's Indian agents negotiated 32 treaties, acquiring over 200,000 square miles of land from Indian tribes. President Monroe, in his second inaugural address, stated, "American westward growth has constantly driven the Indian back, with total sacrifice of land which they've been compelled to abandon." Despite his concern, his administration still removed Indian tribes from states north of the Ohio River. In the South, the 5 civilized tribes adopted the strategy of appeasement. They were tired of all the fighting. They built towns. They accepted settlers' clothing, education, and language. And yet, the settlers still saw them as heathens. President Jackson, in his first inaugural address, stated, "We must observe the Indians with a just and liberal policy." Thus, the Cherokee signed 3 treaties protecting their land. The treaties stipulated that Americans could not settle on Cherokee land, and yet within 14 months, Congress passed Jackson's Removal Act to further continue the progress of civilization. The Removal Act was a hotly debated issue in Congress. The Indian were represented by such people as Davy Crockett. In the Worcester versus Georgia case, the Supreme Court ruled Cherokee Nation's lands were sovereign and that Georgia had no right to extend any laws upon the nations. Jackson ignored the ruling and signed 70 removal treaties and sent 1,000 federal soldiers to forcefully relocate 46,000 Cherokee. imprisoning, murdering, and driving men, women, and children like cattle 2,000 miles to an established Indian territory west of the Mississippi River. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died. This atrocity was known as the Trail of Tears. Despite his atrocities, Jackson gained over 25 million acres of timber and rich farmland for American settlement. On the plains, millions of people poured into the Mississippi West, lured by the promise of gold, cheap land, and a possible better life. The Indians and settlers misunderstood each other from the beginning, and yet again, the most significant difference was land ownership. The Indians owned over vast territories of land they claimed as communal hunting grounds. The settlers saw this as a waste of land, and that land should be surveyed or sold. In the 1860s, many tribes did settle peacefully on government lands. Others resisted giving up their lands and ways of life. This led to the era of Indian wars. Self-interest motivated all the players in the complex interactions between the U.S. and Native Americans. When irreconcilable differences occurred, they were settled by force. When a coiled snake is left alone, it will do no harm. When riled, it will strike, as Chief Red Cloud would say. The government's policy became known as the Indian problem. The statement, "the only good Indian is a dead Indian," was widely accepted. The federal diplomacy became known as the conquest theory. It was a cycle of war. First, settlers would encroach on Native American territory, committing atrocities such as the killing of over 9 million buffalo, which would threaten Indian survival. Then, Indians would engage in random bloody retaliation. After that, American troops would invade on Indian territory to protect the settlers. And finally, peace treaties would be signed, leading to significant Indian land secession. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 was seen as the great triumph for the Native American. The treaty established that the Great Sioux Reservation west of the Missouri River. It also designated the Black Hills, which were sacred to the Sioux, as unceded Indian territory was for exclusive use of Native people. No treaty giving up any part of the reservation would be valid. This treaty established peace for 2 years, allowing wagon trains to pass by undisturbed, until General Custer led an expedition in search of gold, the failure of yet again another treaty. When word of gold reached the newspapers, hundreds of prospectors poured into the Sioux lands. The U.S. Army responded to the plea of settlers and miners and protected them. Ignoring the treaty agreements, they invaded the region. War erupted. The Indian wanted to live peacefully, but they had to protect their land for their children. The betrayers of the treaty led warriors from the reservations to join the other Lakota tribes, led by Chiefs Crazy Horse and Chief Sitting Bull. More than 10,000 Native Americans gathered at a camp by Little Bighorn River. Sitting Bull stated, "If we must die, we die defending our rights." Custer didn't believe the number and attacked, and the entire 7th Cavalry was killed. This marked the greatest victory for Native Americans and the most significant loss for the Army. But ironically, the Battle of Little Bighorn marked the beginning of the end for the Native Americans. The Sioux fled, fearing reprisal. The remaining tribes were made to cede more land and return to the reservations. The failures and consequences of abiding by the U.S. policies and treaties resulted in broken treaties, removal, relocation, vast land loss, population decline, and cultural decimation of the Native Americans. The U.S.'s policy of removal successfully allowed the settlers to reduce conflict between the federal and state governments over Indian policy. It allowed the settlers to occupy the South and the West. It allowed the completion of Manifest Destiny. The U.S. now stretches from coast to coast today, becoming a great nation. But the Native American did not go away. They brought their fires with them and sought to make home where they could obtain their tribal identity. As the Lakota would say, "Wapilla Tonka," Many thanks.